Welcome to the webinar. I'm Ann Silvis, and I'm the Program Leader for Community and Economic Development for University of Illinois Extension. It's great to have all of you with us this afternoon. We gave a few little preliminary housekeeping tidbits, but one of those is that audience, your mics are muted so that we improve the sound quality for the webinar, and you're welcome to use the chat box, and we'll monitor those questions and comments and feed those back to Matt in case he doesn't see them. He can see them too. So use a chat box for questions, comments, etc., and that's a good way for us to keep up with what you're thinking about the webinar. Matt's going to talk for maybe 35, 40, 45 minutes, and then we encouraged him to leave lots of time for questions because I think this is a topic where there could be a lot of questions. So I'm really happy that Matt Johnson can join us. Matt's Vice President Government Policy for Shawnee Communications, which is in Southern Illinois, but he really has the federal perspective of broadband and telecommunications. And also through his work through the Illinois Telecommunications Association has kind of a statewide perspective, which is why it's really nice to have Matt join us today to give us a background and a perspective that is useful in understanding telecommunications and broadband potential for the state. So Matt, I'm going to mute my mic and let you take over. And thanks for joining us.
Great, thank you, Ann. I guess I'm assuming everyone can hear me okay. Please just jump in or let me know if you can't, but I'll try to keep an eye on that. Thank you to Ann Silvis from the U of I Extension for inviting me. I really appreciate it. Ann and I have worked together a long time through a group called Rural Partners, which is really sort of a consortium of rural advocates who work together to advance rural Illinois, make the state a better place, and try to find areas where rural and urban interests can work collaboratively. So we have a diverse group that Rural Partners have been around for, I think, 20 plus years, and I've been involved with that group for about 16 now. So thank you to Ann for giving me this opportunity. As she mentioned, I currently work for Shawnee Communications, which is a small rural broadband provider and telephone provider in about 5 counties in southern Illinois. We're based out of Equality, Illinois, in Gallatin County. We also serve in Saline, Johnson, Pope, and Hardin. We have about 3,500 customers. Currently, we're completing. We're not all the way there, but we're working to complete a fiber optic network to our customers, which we're very proud of, and which is, I think, unique in Illinois and in the country. But largely, what Shawnee is all about is trying to, to use our network to advance economic development, improve the quality of life, grow jobs, and improve the economy, specifically in our region. As a company, we're focused there. As an employee, as Ann mentioned, I'm someone who's worked statewide for a long time. I've been in government and telecommunications, not both, but together, but the whole time, but about 20 years now. So I've worked with the Telecommunications Association previously, also with GTE and Verizon, and also work for the state of Illinois and for the federal government. So that's kind of where my perspective is coming from. And I guess a couple quick admissions before I get too deep. By trade, I'm sort of an advocate for my industry, so I'll definitely sort of give my view or opinion on topics, but trying to be fair of all the different perspectives out there and trying to provide you, the participants, with good information. But it certainly, there is because it's what I do, I tend to have a little bit of a slant. Secondly, telecom regulation. Some of this stuff can be a bit arcane, so bear with me. My wife always tells me that if I want to, put the kids to bed at night, I can just talk to them about what I do and talk about telecom legislation or read them a bill, and they'd be asleep within minutes. And finally, I was putting this presentation together during the first series of baseball games where my home team, the Cardinals, were playing the Cubs. So I put a bit of a baseball theme into the presentation. So that'll hopefully make it a little bit more interesting. So see if I can make sure I navigate to the first slide here, or this, I guess I should say the second slide. I kind of gave you a quick history and background on Shawnee. I think obviously we as a company and as a person, broadband is something that I've worked on a long time. I probably don't have to talk to this group too much about the importance of high-speed internet or broadband. I kind of use those terms interchangeably, and why it's important for rural and urban communities, suburban communities of all kinds, making sure that we have connectivity throughout all of our communities throughout the state. In terms of when we start talking about federal broadband policy, specifically where I'm going to be sort of focused on is sort of the roots of, first I'm going to start talking a little bit about sort of the roots of where we currently are with federal regulation of rural broadband, and I'll try to talk about broadband from a statewide perspective as well. But the Universal Service Fund is something that was created in 1996 in the 1996 Telecommunications Act, so it's well over 20 years old. And basically, it was a public policy that, similar to rural electrification many years earlier, the Congress in the act decided that it was in our best interest to make sure. Actually, I apologize. It goes back even longer than 1996, but basically making sure that that rural customers throughout the country were able to receive what I refer to as POTS, or plain old telephone service, in a way that is both from a price perspective and a service perspective reasonably comparable to the way urban areas receive it. So Congress saw that as a strong public policy. They wanted to make sure. Happen, and that's kind of became the foundation for rural broadband policy. And most recently, moving on to the next slide, the FCC has really spent the last about 7 years trying to sort of recreate or reform the Universal Service Fund. And what they did is they put together a national broadband plan, which was really a national broadband plan. It wasn't just a rural broadband plan, to create what they were calling a Connect America Fund. The roots of that started in 2010, and ultimately, over the course of several years, in their efforts to sort of reform the program, they wanted to shift this. Eventually, wanted to shift the financial support for USF from plain old telephone service to broadband. So, where traditionally the support was to make sure everyone got phone service. As time has gone on, obviously, with the transformational power of broadband and the internet in people's lives, they saw fit to make sure that that financial support was moving toward broadband. So even just in the last year, they put together an order that basically moved the legacy providers, meaning rural telephone companies and rural broadband providers, to a new form of regulation. So that resulted in the Universal Service Fund Reform Order of 2016, which did several very important things. It created sort of two paths for the future of rural broadband providers. There's a model path, and there's a traditional rate of return path. The model path was created to sort of move some of the small companies to more of an alternative form of regulation. And it wasn't offered to everybody, and not all companies were interested in it. But basically, it allowed either a model company or a rate of return company to move the support to standalone broadband, so that basically the practical effect is a customer could get standalone broadband. Some call it naked DSL, just a broadband connection provided to them. And additionally, it renewed the federal focus on building broadband to unserved locations. Definitely, it was a public policy interest in making sure that more broadband got out to more people. It also lowered the rate of return for those who were remaining on rate of return, which was not one of the most popular things seen by the industry itself, but it lowered the rate of return with the idea of trying to get more dollars, I guess, into actually, and towards building broadband as possible. And then it continued the policy, as I mentioned earlier, of reasonable comparability. So it's the same with what I mentioned earlier about the plain old telephone service, trying to get reasonably comparable service at reasonably comparable rates between rural and urban. So a rural customer has something that's price-wise and service-wise is similar to their urban counterpart. And so the order came out early, let's see, was it late last year? And so we're still sort of in the throes of the changes. And there's actually a lot of questions right now about whether the USF is even sufficient, that what they designated for the fund to really support rural broadband build out over the next 10 years. I can make available when I have an opportunity to make. There's a letter provided from about 56 U.S. senators to the FCC. Asking questions about the ability of the Universal Service Fund to truly do the job in rural America and making sure broadband got as many places as possible. So I think that's one of the sort of the first big follow-up items after the letter. Congress is sort of, or at least the Senate side, and I think the House side is poised to do the same. It's sort of re-emphasizing its desire to make sure that, hey, you know what, this is very important. We want to make sure that broadband gets everywhere. The next slide, slide 5, and this is this is just sort of one slide I provided. There's a lot of studies out there, but one of the most recent studies was done by the Hudson Institute, and you can probably cut and paste or perhaps click into that the study I provided there, the URL. Basically saying, hey, you know what? Broadband is important in rural areas. It's important in urban areas. And the main theme behind this was, broadband is not just something that we need to make sure, or we got to make sure that rural areas aren't getting left behind. Broadband in rural areas alone resulted in 2015 in $100 billion in e-commerce traveling across the networks. $24 billion contributed to state economies. And 34% of that was attributable to rural areas, 66 accrues to urban areas. So the point there is, and obviously, 66,000 direct jobs from rural broadband. So while the rural broadband providers are, in comparison to large corporations, are not enormous, but you can see the economic impacts are real, and the accrual of benefits to urban areas is real. And while we tend to have sort of in America right now, there's somewhat of in certain rural areas, there's shrinking population. There's sort of a migration to suburban and urban areas, and this study is very important, sort of emphasizing that rural areas matter. What they're doing matters. It provides jobs. It provides infrastructure. It provides economic power. And it doesn't just accrue locally. It accrues to urban areas. Moving on to slide 6. So sort of going back to federal policy, I think largely what helped drive the order at the FCC and what in the previous presidential administration, and I think largely has been recognized. We're still early in the new Trump administration, but the public opinion and that politicians, there's still policy being driven that people believe that there needs to be more broadband, and that's not just in rural areas. There needs to be more in urban areas, and making sure that we're not that people aren't getting left behind. And as we saw from the Hudson Institute, in which we all know, getting broadband unleashes the power of small businesses, which means economic development, especially in rural areas where we have more sort of not necessarily more entrepreneurship, but those help drive the local economies, which means jobs, and also making sure that our infrastructure, our connectivity in the healthcare arena is robust. We have a lot of examples especially in rural areas where more and more where we've got things like pharmacies and rural health clinics or critical access hospitals who are asking for high-speed internet connections to larger institutions or perhaps labs and other things. So there's a lot of examples where, even in our service area in Southern Illinois, where we have healthcare providers who need that high-speed internet connection to get connected to the larger hub hospitals. Education's the same way. One thing I failed to mention as part of the Universal Service Fund, there's basically four parts. The part I mostly talked about was the high cost fund, which goes to providing broadband directly to customers. There's also Lifeline program, which provides connectivity for individual customers for telephone service, and they're talking about eventually doing it as sort of a voucher for broadband. There's a healthcare fund. There's also E-rate, and so that brings us back to the education piece. Especially now and even in the coming year or so, there's additional resources being directed from the Universal Service Fund to Lifeline Healthcare and especially E-rate. So there's a lot of opportunities for schools to get connected to high-speed connections, and there's certainly a policy push to make sure more of our schools are getting better connections to make sure our students aren't getting left behind. So another sort of piece of federal policy, and this sort of applies to the internet, but also to broadband generally, is traditionally the feds have kind of looked at the broadband and the growth of the internet as something that they've kind of had a hands-off policy on. They've let the internet grow largely without heavy regulation, and obviously it's transformed our lives in the process. And largely their policy of treating broadband traditionally as an interstate service has allowed broadband to grow as well, and sort of avoided the I guess what sometimes we call in the industry sort of the patchwork regulation of the internet and of broadband. And I think that has benefited. I think that's benefited customers. I think it's benefited the industry. I think it's meant for a more robust broadband internet ecosystem. Just give me a moment here. I'm going to catch up with myself. So the last line where I put federal versus state versus local. This is This is something that has sort of transformed, I suppose, in the last couple of years, especially at the end of the Obama administration as we transition to the Trump administration. Sort of this discussion about what the appropriate role of the FCC is, and there was the beginning of a discussion. And again, I don't want to get too deep into the telecom regulation terms, but from sort of a move from the traditional hands-off approach to treating broadband providers or the broadband ecosystem as sort of a common carrier. And so the question is, going forward is how is the federal government going to continue to treat broadband providers? Will they be more sort of involved, like what we've seen with some of the net neutrality things? And at the same time, we've got the state and local groups, local government, state government, who are still kind of trying to figure out, hey, how do we fit into this equation? Most recently, in New York, the state of New York, there was I think $250 million that was designated for what the USF became the Connect America Fund. They basically put together a broadband sort of stimulus program in New York because Verizon had turned down that chunk of money to do infrastructure and broadband there. So the FCC designated the money to the state of New York, and they did build out there and did a build out sort of RFP and allowed companies of all stripes to basically apply for grants to build internet to customers, to whoever needed it, all types of customers, residential, business, anchor institutions, and what have you. So there's an example of the state role. And then, the local role, I think, continues to evolve. There's been some discussion between the FCC and some of the states about, whether local should be local municipalities, I guess, should be or states should be able to determine the framework by which a municipality might be able to provide internet service if there's no one else providing it there. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. So sort of going back to, I guess what we call what I termed here the middle relief, the FCC definitely, continued the Universal Service Fund, the High Cost Fund, to make sure that the build out continued to rural areas. And how we refer to it in the industry is they rebuilt the USF engine. There's still a lot of questions, as I mentioned earlier, about the sufficiency of the budget. Is it enough to do the job? Also the sustainability of a budget, because as you sort of incentivize build out, you also drive up the frequency or the number of companies who are looking to build out, which creates sort of a crush on the budget. And so, as I mentioned, making sure that the fund is doing its job and making sure that rural customers have reasonably comparable services and rates as their urban counterparts. So largely a good news story. I think the verdict is still sort of out on some of the small details of it, I think largely I consider it a good news story for rural America. A couple of sort of ongoing issues out there. I guess these are more question marks, starting with the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill, and I think there's some folks maybe from USDA on this call. USDA has traditionally provided low-interest broadband loans to providers to do build-out, and many providers have been able to leverage their resources and leverage the USDA's resources to build out and get more, to basically build more broadband in rural areas. The Farm Bill could be, if it's sort of reauthorized and taken up in Washington D.C., and if they can, sort of come together and decide on some policies, that there could be changes, hopefully good changes, or there could be additional funding put in there to make sure that, or perhaps even some new programs to make sure that broadband continues to get to the areas, and certainly in the interest of USDA to try to make sure that happens, and I think in the interest of rural America. Another big question mark, which was sort of thrown out there early in the administration, but we're still trying to figure out what it all means, was the, I guess, sort of $1 trillion infrastructure program that has been mentioned by the Trump folks and the administration, but it's sort of short on details at this point. We, obviously, as state governments, municipal governments, and people who are looking to make sure their communities remain vibrant, infrastructure of all kinds is going to be very, very important. We think as an industry that broadband should be in that discussion. And I think no specific dollars have been put on any particular. I don't think anything specifically on this. But is that something that the president can do? Is that something that Congress can put together the votes for? As sort of a quasi stimulus, or making sure that the building of bridges, roads, water, all the other things that the federal government can help do. Broadband we believe it should be in that discussion, and trying to figure out if there's any gaps, how can we fill those with infrastructure dollars. Some other sort of There's been some other discussion on tax incentives. I believe the president has made mention of sort of tax incentives specifically as perhaps a suite of different tax changes that you'd like to make. I think from strictly from perspective of a small telecommunications company, in order to benefit from a income tax incentive, we actually have to be able to make money. And the profitability in rural broadband is very tight, obviously because of you've got universal service helping make that happen. There's been other things talked about. I don't know how much publicly this has been talked about. I'd like to see it discussed more. Is hey, if the FCC sees sort of sees it as good public policy to consolidate rural companies or to get more rural companies to get involved in broadband, where some of the larger providers might perhaps be interested in getting rid of some of the rural areas. What are some tax incentives that can be offered to incentivize consolidation within the industry? And then some others that have been talked about, always sort of regularly talked about, is the tax treatment of purchase of broadband equipment. I think that's sort of more of an incremental tax change that could help, but that's one of the things that have been talked about. Let me see, moving on to the next. This last one, barriers to deployment, I think what I'll do is I'll talk about that in a little bit when we talk about some of the things that are going on specifically sort of on deck or on base with the FCC right now. So this is the at the plate slide 8 here. This is where I wanted to sort of offer some kind of initial thoughts on how you as a community, how you as a leader in your community, how you might think about broadband. Recognizing that a rural provider like myself, there's about 40 of us in Illinois. We don't cover every corner of the state. Where we do, I think we do a pretty darn good job of getting the internet, getting high-speed internet, and getting a robust broadband product out there. Are there communities that perhaps have been that still need more work, or the speeds you're not happy with the speed? I think there's questions there about, and as I mentioned earlier, there's been debate between the feds and the states about what is the appropriate role for a community who just can't get service. So I think one of the first considerations that if you're thinking about that is there an existing provider there? In most cases there are. Approaching them first. Sometimes I don't know about the availability of someone locally. Sometimes it might take a little work, but I always encourage communities to reach out directly to the provider with questions. And I guess before you even do that, I think determining needs is something you should think about before you start making those calls. And I kind of put it a couple points down. I probably should have reorganized those, but I think an assessment of needs is critical, and that I don't think that has to be something that is a huge project or necessarily need a consultant to do, but just sort of determining what your local needs are. Is this an issue where you might need to connect up a few community buildings and just need to talk to somebody about trying to get connections between those that are robust and perhaps redundant? Or is this something where is it more of an external thing? Is it customers and businesses, residences and businesses, I should say, who are really experiencing a situation where they'd like to have higher speeds or a more robust infrastructure? And so then once you've sort of assessed that, the question need to be asked, hey, is there an existing provider available? And I think part of that, the reason for that is so important is because telecommunications is a very, very competitive market. There's wireless providers out there. There's wireless internet service providers or WISPs out there. cable companies, microwave providers, any number of private sector providers out there who can provide different types of solutions. There's communities who may have a microwave on top of their water tower, and it works pretty darn good for people, and it gets residences and small businesses hooked up. But I think that's something that you definitely need to think about at first. And if in fact you as a community decide to move forward, what are the questions needed to be asking? Are we making sure that we're getting local input? Does there need to be a local referendum? Do we want to make sure that the community is truly bought off on what we're trying to do? Because entering into a competitive marketplace is not for the faint of heart. And there's been a lot of stories documented, some successful, some not so successful, and the ones that have not been so successful are not successful in the tune of millions and tens of millions and hundreds of millions of dollars. So making sure that there's a lot of local input, and also I think transparency in the entire process, making sure that the public knows what's going on, and that if you get there, that pricing and the way this is all being paid for is put out there for the public to see. Finally, I think sometimes we've seen cases even in the state, I think, where the assessment for risks might be left lacking, or at least an assessment of what's needed to run telecommunications network. There's network needed to hook up offices. There's a point of presence or a POP you need to connect to make sure that the customers have a connection, a gateway out into the internet. There's one-time costs. There's recurring costs, which occur monthly. How are you going to bill? How is customer service provided? Who's going to do the accounting? What state and federal certifications might be needed? And then questions about the billing situation, the taxes and surcharges that go on a telecommunications bill. Are they going to be the same or similar as a private sector counterpart? Same with right-of-way. Is the right-of-way treatment of a public sector provider going to be same as a private sector? So there's sort of competitive fairness, openness, transparency issues abundant when you start talking about that. So, get input, talk to private sector providers, assess your risk, assess your needs, and make sure it's you've done a 360 evaluation before you go down that road. Moving on, sort of something I mentioned earlier, sort of what I consider broadband issues. I guess I'm calling these now on base. These are some things that I think they're of particular interest to communities right now that are going on. One is the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. This is something that the new chairman of the FCC, Chairman Ajit Pai, has set up to look at what I would call barriers to entry, or situations where broadband providers are trying to get out to the community, and there may be right-of-way issues or licensing or certification issues that federal, state, and local entities have in place that are slowing the development of broadband. So I think it's in that context, it's very important to think about the sort of balancing that the public interest in making sure we get broadband as fast and as quickly as possible, versus making sure that your community is protected by appropriate licensing and appropriate right-of-way approvals, both from communities, and also in some cases it might be from private entities, private landowners, railroads, a lot of things out there that go into building when you're doing build out in a telecommunications network. And the feds are sort of starting to take a look at that and say, how can we sort of streamline this to make sure we're speeding the availability of broadband to customers. Firstnet is another one. You may have heard this. This is, I think it was started in a 2011 tax legislation. I forget the name of it, but basically came out of 9/11 and the perceived lack of bandwidth availability for public safety personnel during the 9/11 tragedy in New York and Washington, D.C. And Firstnet is basically a national public safety broadband network. And so what happened is, you know, the World Trade Center came down, you know, terrible tragedy, and public safety personnel, fire, police, EMTs, and others are trying to communicate with each other at the same over the wireless networks, which, you know, basically is a broadband network, and they were basically fighting with traffic from people who were calling home to their mother or their significant others or family to make sure to tell them they were okay. So 10 years later, 10 years later, the feds were able to put together legislation that designated $7 billion and some spectrum from a spectrum auction at the FCC wireless spectrum to begin a public safety broadband network. So significant amount of dollars, $7 billion, but when you're talking about building a nationwide network, probably is more a drop in the bucket. But this is going full steam ahead. You may have read in the papers recently that AT&T has just won the contract to provide the sort of end user capability to public safety agencies. So that was very significant, and they're gonna get started. I think it's a 25 or 30-year contract AT&T has to make this happen. Each of the states has the ability to opt in or opt out of the network, and if they opt out, then they would be building that network on their own that would connect into FirstNet. So Illinois is still evaluating that. I think there's still some discussion happening in the state administration here in Illinois to determine whether that's the right way to go or not. But if you're talking about a nationwide network and you're talking about trying to build a statewide network, it gets pretty expensive quickly, and everybody knows the state of Illinois is not exactly in the best financial situation right now. Another big one coming down the pike, or actually we're already there, it's been a little bit more incremental, is next generation 911. People have always traditionally been able to dial 911 in emergency situations. And the next generation means basically is the ability to text to 911 or the ability to send video pictures to the 911 personnel in your county's, you know, state or city. And it'll be transformational technology. But it's happening slowly. It's obviously going to be very expensive, but it's going to transform the way we communicate in emergency situations. And I think eventually will help, you know, definitely help emergency personnel reach parties who are in trouble quicker and get to and assess emergency situations quicker and better. So that is definitely on the radar, and it's probably coming to your community fairly soon. And then finally, last on the list here is 5G wireless. Everybody knows what their smartphones are all about, and you know we can't live without them. We're moving from a 4G to a 5G network, and the network is going to be moving further and further out. So small cells means that you'll be going from receiving your signal, especially beginning in the urban areas, you go from receiving your signal from a tower to receiving a signal more locally that might be in your building or a multi-dwelling unit, or you know, some other area, or you know, even on the the train station platform. There'll be small cells everywhere to basically speed the connectivity you have between your phone and the network, and we'll provide ultra-fast wireless connectivity. That is definitely on the minds of the large providers right now. It will probably start, as I said, in the larger communities where the densities of customers are larger. But as it gets built out, they will be looking for more and more small areas to put up to make sure that people have wireless connectivity. So I guess just to quickly summarize, about 40 minutes in, as I mentioned, rural broadband policy made a major transformation in 2016. The FCC focused on, the focus has largely been on build out. They want to see more broadband, and I think public opinion has followed that. Is we need more build out, we need more broadband to people, we need build out everywhere. We're going to make sure that no American is without the ability to connect to the internet, and in a very fast way. We also talked a little bit about what broadband means for our communities. I think we have a pretty good feel for that. But largely it's jobs, and it's e-commerce. It's people doing their grocery shopping or buying goods and services through the internet, and more commerce is happening over the internet every single day. Also, it's making connectivity for our schools faster and more available to smaller and smaller areas, and to more and more schools who need high-speed internet connections to connect with themselves and connect with other schools, either locally or internationally. Healthcare, as I mentioned, hospitals need more and more connectivity and a higher bandwidth to transfer files. The machines, MRIs and other X-rays and all the things that healthcare facilities are using to do diagnoses and analysis need high-speed internet connections to get that image or that data from the customer to the doctor to the facility for analysis and diagnosis. And that's becoming more and more important, especially, I would say, in rural areas. Next point, I think just sort of understanding, that's sort of a very general way of saying it, but the issues surrounding broadband, and if you're thinking about it in your community. But obviously, I don't think there can be any doubt that the faster that build out happens and the fewer barriers, as we mentioned, to entry, the more investment's going to happen, and the quicker the broadband networks are going to get built nationwide. So if you're thinking about it as a community, make sure and assess your needs locally, and communicate with the private sector. Make sure they understand exactly what your needs are, and try to understand exactly what your needs are. I didn't really talk about this earlier, but the sexy thing to talk about is sort of a gig to the community, or a gig to the customer. And I think someday that's something that will be very much needed. I mean, everyone. Technology progresses so quickly that sometimes we can't even understand in 10 years what kind of connectivity needs might be out there, what kind of bandwidth might be needed. But gig connectivity is coming, but it may not be what's needed yet. And I think sometimes you sort of have to start at 4 meg, 10 meg, 25 meg, 50 meg, 100 meg connections, downloads to, in order to take the next step, and just sort of saying, well, we need a fiber connection, or we need a gig to our community, might be an important selling point for the Chamber of Commerce, but it may not be necessarily what you need at that particular point in time. So that's why a needs assessment is so important. So I guess at this point I'll be happy to open it up to any questions, and if anything in the presentation, or if people have other questions about telecommunications issues at the federal level, we'll be happy to discuss, or state level as well.
Matt, this is Ann. I'm looking at a couple questions that came in on the chat box. So let me read you the first one, and then while Matt's responding, if anyone has questions, please type them into the chat box. The first question is, currently we're seeing the larger ISPs merging and creating larger companies that create less choices for consumers. How do you see this competition playing? How do you see competition playing into this? Does it make it more difficult for the development of broadband in rural areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that the larger internet service providers. I mean, you've got I don't know, I've been in the telecommunications industry for almost 20 years now, and it's almost a joke about how, you went from the legacy AT&T, and then you split the companies into the regional Bell operating companies, and then they came together and became AT&T again, and then you end up with Verizon and Comcast and T-Mobile and others. So that's certainly there's certainly been sort of a concentration of larger providers. Less choices for consumers. I don't know. I think I just feel like, especially with the younger generation, the millennials, which everyone's talking about right now, they don't care where the connection comes from. They just want high-speed internet, and they want it. They want it now. It doesn't matter if it's if it's a small cell built out into their multiple dwelling unit, or if it's coming from a microwave dish or through a connection in their home, a wired connection. It's they just need that connectivity. The rural areas. I think what you have seen is the large providers are sort of they're focused more on the bigger cities. So I do think that's one of the unique challenges of broadband. I think that's one of the big goals of the Universal Service Fund is trying to help make sure that rural communities, rural areas continue to have and don't get left behind on high speed internet and broadband speeds. But I do see that as an issue, especially because it's just so darn expensive to build a network, and it doesn't matter if it's wireless or wireline. It's incredibly expensive to build a network. It's not easy to maintain. I think when you're talking about doing it on a nationwide basis in a country as large as ours, it's going to take time. I mean, there's a lot of comparisons made of the U.S. to Korea and to other very concentrated countries, and I don't think you can compare those two. Those countries that will be compared to are the size of one of our states. And so it's going to take time. It's probably not as fast as everybody wants, but I think we've come a long way. We're certainly not there yet, but you can see, as I mentioned, that at least the feds are paying attention, and they're still trying to make sure that as much money as possible gets out into those networks and built to rural customers.
Okay, let me ask another question. Actually, this is my question, but there isn't another one yet, so I'm going to ask you my question. And so my question is, typically, who in the community would conduct the assessment? You mentioned that one of the things that is appropriate for people to do at community level is conduct an assessment of needs. And so I'm wondering who does that, and how do they do it? And could you provide any guidance or resources for communities that are thinking about doing that?
Yeah, I don't think that's a good question. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer to that. Some of it depends on really the sort of technological IQ of the leadership in a particular community. It depends on the size of the community and whether they might have the resources. I know there's, I guess, a couple of things. It might be a tech-savvy leader, or someone who's willing to sort of go and ask the hard questions. So that's one option. I know there's consultants out there who can help get you the right, ask the right questions, conduct assessments, both internally and externally of the community. I know they're out there. I'm not telling you to go out and spend $100,000 on a consultant, especially if it's something you think you might be able to do. I think it's truthfully, I think places like group I'm involved with, Rural Partners, perhaps Extension. There's resources probably through USDA and others where I think you can get reasonable help from people who do this regularly. And in my experience in Rural Partners, I know we've worked some with communities doing assessments, not just of broadband or technology, through the Western Illinois University Rural Affairs, IARA, Institute for Rural Affairs, and I would argue Extension can probably do some of those same things, but trying to look at state state resources that are out there, and try to help. I don't do that myself, but I know there's also consultants out there, and also technology companies, and there's also broadband companies who might have someone on staff who's willing to sit down and help you. I know if someone came to us in our service area, we'd be happy to try to help them find solutions, or at least help them do an assessment.
When you're talking about building out broadband, can you explain that a little bit more? You had mentioned earlier, I think, as we were prepping for this webinar, about Shawnee's build out and what that means and in terms of service and durability, et cetera. So could you talk a little bit more to define build out?
Sure, yeah. I think build out can mean a lot of things, but I think for Shawnee's purposes, and this is a business model. This is largely a question of business model, but it's also a question of technology. So, for Shawnee, our business model, the technology we chose was fiber. So we thought it made the most sense to build a fiber network over the existing copper network. So copper was, in some cases, the copper that's been in the ground, statewide, and a lot of companies still have a lot of copper in their network around Illinois and around the country. And in many cases, the electronics that go into a copper network, which basically sends electric signals across the copper, are increasingly antiquated. So we felt like building a fiber network, which is runs basically at the speed of light and is electronic, light carrying zeros and ones, and digital technology was the way to go, because the electronics that are being built are all moving towards fiber networks, and they're getting cheaper and cheaper and easier to build further out into the network, which means as you build further out into the network, think of it like a wheel. And a central office would be the hub, which is sort of our office where all our electronics, not all of them, but the majority of electronics are held. And then the spokes go out into the community to the end users. And so the electronics that are being built can go further and further out into the network, which makes the network faster and faster. And if fiber can be used to do that, then it means your ability to get high-speed internet in your home or business, especially in this case, for example, Shawnee's area, is you have the ability to get a gig to your house basically if you want it, which is incredibly fast. And I'd challenge you to find something that can use that on a regular basis in your home. Probably not. But fiber to us was the way to get sort of a future-proof network for our business. Now, wireless companies see it differently. Although that's changing. With the small cells, they're moving fiber to small cells. So they're also moving fiber closer to the customer, but using wireless technology to get from sort of the endpoint to the customer. And so they view sort of a different customer experience there, using all wireless all the time. Whereas we're getting people's homes and businesses, and they can do Wi-Fi or wireless from there. But there's still a lot of companies, and a lot of good companies, who can provide very fast internet service, who still use sort of the traditional copper. And so there are electronics that can be made that can talk between the copper and fiber network. So the fiber is pushing further and further out from the hub and replacing more and more copper. And as you're seeing that, what that means is there's just the network becomes higher speed the more fiber connectivity you have within it. So I guess to kind of get back to the question, the backbone, the middle mile, and the end user experience are all better, faster, stronger, more robust, easier to fix using fiber technology, which means basically glass running through a piece of conduit as opposed to copper running through a conduit.
That was a very good answer. I had no idea that was
That's
that.
probably way more than you needed, but
You know what? But it actually makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad I asked that question. Now I'm going to ask you another question. This is in the chat box from Mayor Bill Westcott from Rock Falls.
Mhm.
He says, Rock Falls, Illinois, population 9,266. We are currently underway with our own fiber broadband project to make our community a gigabit community. Local provider Comcast absolutely wanted nothing to do with increasing speeds for either our residents or business, so we are taking the project on ourselves. This FCC money is great, but with such a low minimum of 25 MBS, it is, which I don't know what that means, it is hard to get those funds. Most providers that do not want to improve service for their customers provide the minimum and prohibit FCC monies. Do you see any changes possible to make the minimum speed higher since the speed is so important?
well, I got to be careful here as a, sort of an industry guy, but certainly from the Shawnee perspective, I think the definition of high-speed internet should definitely go up. Because it's happening regularly. What we all view as a high connection 10 years ago or 5 years ago or 3 years ago is not what we consider a high-speed connection now. So I think over time we'll see an increase. With the recent order, sort of in the, 10.1 kind of became the standard, but there's in certain more dense areas, they're pushing 25.3 over the next 10 years. So I think, yes, the Fed specifically are going to be incrementally moving the minimum speeds higher.
There's another.
As far as a time frame and how that's going to happen, when it's going to happen, I don't know.
Matt, you had mentioned earlier a map that is provided by the Illinois Telecommunications Association that shows who's providing in what areas.
Mm-hmm.
Is that available to people? And do you want to just mention that, how
Yeah.
that's available?
Yes, it's that map. There is a map. Now that it contains all what I would call the incumbent local exchange carriers. So there's about 40 of them. It includes basically it's AT&T, Frontier, Consolidated, CenturyLink, and then all the small phone companies like Shawnee. And they're exchange areas. It's not per town. It's per exchange. So the Equality Exchange, for example, might have a couple other communities within that exchange. So it doesn't show every community or every dot on the map, but it does show the exchanges as they were traditionally regulated by the ICC. And that map can be found. You can get a copy of that from the Illinois Telecommunications Association, il-ita.com, I believe. And you can get a full color copy, and you can also get I'm going to really antiquate myself now, a Mylar overlay, basically a plastic overlay showing all the counties, or at least a rough estimate of all the counties in the state as an overlay of the exchange area. So I find it quite useful. It's something I use almost daily, in my job, just trying to get a feel for, and having conversations about telecommunications.
So I just typed the Illinois Telecommunications Association note into the chat box. So if people search on that and go to their website, can they find it there?
Yes.
Okay.
I don't think there's a way to directly order it online. You'd probably have to reach out to the ITA.
Okay.
But I better give them a heads up that I said this, because they may not have the capacity to answer all the phone calls.
Okay.
So leave a message. Leave a message for Joyce, and she'll take care of you.
All right. Are there other questions?
There's one about city-owned
Yeah, I see that
lead
one.
broadband service providers. Springfield, Missouri comes up as a leader in that area. Yeah, I think there's probably, I think Chattanooga is another one that they sort of considering a success story. I guess it depends on how you define that. But I certainly understand if a community can't get what they think they want, and they have the resources to be able to put that into a network. I get that. But that's building a network is one thing, maintaining it is another, and servicing customers is yet another. So there's probably as many cautionary tales there are success stories, and I don't know. I've never measured how many there are. I know in Illinois, Springfield, Illinois even has. I think they've done. They've at least talked about a network. Some communities have done sort of Wi-Fi's downtown, and some have worked with private sector providers to help make that happen. Some maybe have done it on their own. I think the city of Chicago has a pretty robust network. They talked about doing Wi-Fi, but they backed off when they found out how much it was going to be. And I know there's a couple communities, perhaps in addition to Rock Falls, that are doing some, have done some projects. So, my only, it's just just a word of caution. That's all I'm providing. But if communities are interested in doing that, there's at least from the federal perspective, and the state perspective, there's nothing stopping them legally from doing that.
I think that ties into a point you made earlier, Matt, is that these systems, because the technology changes so quickly and because it's really a business model that's market driven, it's really hard to know what you're getting into and to be the expert enough to design and build and manage a system that's good for now and good for the future.
Yeah, I mean,
That's kind of what I'm hearing you saying.
yeah, think about the resources that we as a private provider put into it, and then you sort of add on that, someone who's trying to make sure the trains run on time in their home community. It's a pretty significant undertaking. So, yeah, it's not something to be entered into lightly, but I think just making sure that dotting your T's and crossing your I's is important, making sure there's as much disclosure and transparency as possible, and making sure that there's a plan for the future. Because, like I said, there's been even in the last, I suppose specifically 10 years in Illinois, there's been a lot of networks built. But as to whether they've all been sort of sustainable and continued to can be maintained, and where there's robust customer service, sometimes sometimes you end up with a network that's you can, if you're not careful, end up with a network that's sort of stranded investment. So just a word to the wise.
Nancy just posted a poll question that you can mark just to give us a sense of whether or not we hit the mark in terms of identifying and providing information on topics that you wanted to know. So just mark that poll. And I want to close by saying a couple things. One is that next month the webinar topic will be planning for disaster and the disaster recovery efforts that are going on, planning and recovery efforts that are going on around the state. Because you're signed into this webinar, we'll give you an announcement of that next one. And then I want to thank Matt for this providing the content for this webinar. It was really great to have access to everything you know. I feel as if we've just kind of skimmed the surface of what the topic is, but I really appreciate you providing this context for our thinking and planning and understanding what broadband can be, not just for rural areas, but for the entire state, and how federal policy is enmeshed and what our options are for this planning out community and state access to broadband and telecommunications. So thanks, Matt.
Thank you.
We'll stay on the line just a few more minutes in case somebody wants to ask another question, but I think for the most part, we're going to wrap this up.
Thank you, Ann. I did see, and yes, I think sometimes in order to take a deeper dive, it would take a lot more time, but I noticed someone pointed out that Broadband Illinois used to have maps with providers on. I think broadbandillinois.org is still a website out there that you can find maps. I'm not sure how updated they are, but fcc.gov, the FCC's website, also has, you can go, it's a pretty great tool. I forget exactly what it's called, but it's a broadband speed mapping tool where you can bring up any given community and find out, I think maybe even specific providers in that community, what kind of connectivity they're providing, how fast it is, and then you can sort of change by speed. So if you want to say, okay, is there a 10 meg provider in my community, then it'll overlap that. And if you click off 10 meg and go to 25 meg, then it'll have that color on there. So that's a pretty useful map too as well. I would recommend that to people as well.
Yeah, that's good to know. I do remember that when there was a program where you could go in and put in your community or zip code or what have you, and
Yes.
then you would get an assessment of what your broadband speed was. I don't know how accurate that was, but it was interesting.
Well, the federal maps at the FCC, I think, are still updated pretty regularly.
Okay.
So,
Okay. Okay. Any more questions for Matt before we close?
well, thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. It was great to have you, Matt.
Yep, enjoyed it.
Thanks. Bye-bye.